Tonight, we descend into that mystery. We trace the words that Plato whispered to the ages, follow the seekers who have searched every ocean, and rest finally in the silence where Atlantis waits, neither proven nor forgotten, eternal in its mystery. There is a story that will not die. It has persisted for 24 centuries, has survived the fall of empires and the rise of sciences that should have buried it beneath rational explanation. It has been dismissed as allegory, as political fiction, as philosophical thought experiment. Yet it returns again and again in the dreams of those who sense that something lies hidden beneath the surface of what we know. The story speaks of an island that should not have existed, a civilization that rose to greatness in an age before history learned to record itself, a kingdom that threatened to conquer the known world before the earth opened and the waters rose and everything was swallowed in a single night of divine judgment. Atlantis. The name itself carries weight, carries the echo of waves closing over temples, the silence of streets where no foot has walked since the catastrophe, the mystery of a people who achieved wonders and then vanished so completely that only a philosopher's dialogue preserves their memory. Tonight, we enter that mystery not to solve it, but to dwell within it. We are not concerned with proving or disproving what cannot be proven or disproven. We are concurrent with an understanding why this story has haunted human imagination since Plato first set stylus to papyrus. Why each generation finds new meaning in the island that sank. Why the dream of Atlantis persists when countless other ancient tales have faded into the silence from which they emerged. The journey we undertake is a journey through layers, through the words of an Athenian philosopher, through the temple archives of Egyptian priests, through the concentric rings of a city designed by a god, through the corruption that led to catastrophe and the waters that preserve what they destroyed. We will trace the seekers who have followed the riddle across every ocean, who have proposed locations from the Caribbean to Antarctica, from the coast of Spain to the depths of the Mediterranean. We will descend into the imagination where Atlantis exists most vividly, where coral grows on marble columns and fish swim through halls where kings once gathered. This is not a story of certainty. Certainty has no place in these waters. The greatest minds have disagreed about what Plato intended, about whether he was recording history or crafting allegory, about whether the island was real or symbolic, or some mysterious blend of both. The mud that Plato claimed blocked navigation to the site has its parallel in the muddied waters of interpretation, where clarity seems always just out of reach. But the uncertainty is part of the gift. The mystery is part of what makes the story sacred. If Atlantis could be located definitively, excavated thoroughly, explained completely, something essential would be lost. The quality that has made this story more than historical curiosity, that has transformed it into myth in the deepest sense, into a story that speaks to something fundamental in human consciousness. We approach with reverence tonight because the subject demands reverence. Not because Atlantis was necessarily real in the way that Athens was real or Egypt was real, but because it has been real in human imagination for over 2 millennia. has shaped how we think about lost civilizations and golden ages, and the fragility of even the greatest achievements. The Atlantis that lives in collective memory is as worthy of contemplation as any archaeological site, perhaps more worthy because it reveals not merely what humans built, but what humans dream. The night is long and the waters are deep. We will not hurry through these contemplations, but will allow each chapter to unfold at the pace that mystery requires. The story of Atlantis is not a story to be rushed through, but to be dwelt within, to be absorbed slowly as the conscious mind quiets and the deeper mind opens to receive what ancient voices have to offer. Plato claimed he was telling truth. The Egyptian priests claimed they had preserved records for 9,000 years. The catastrophe they described would place Atlantis' destruction at the end of the last ice age, in a time when sea levels were rising and coastlines were transforming, when the world itself was emerging from conditions we can barely imagine into something closer to what we know today. Is there truth beneath the myth? Is there myth that has become its own kind of truth? The questions cannot be separated, cannot be answered with the precision that modern minds prefer. We can only enter the story and let it speak what it will speak, reveal what it will reveal, conceal what it insists on concealing. The island waits. It has waited for 10,000 years, if the counting is true. It has waited in the depths of ocean or in the depths of imagination. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. Perhaps in some space between that our categories cannot capture. Let the mind grow quiet. Let the breath slow and deepen. Let the waves of ordinary thought settle into the stillness that contemplation requires. We descend now into the mystery of Atlantis. We may not surface with answers, but we will surface changed by the questions. The island awaits. Let us begin our descent. In the amber light of an Athenian evening, sometime around 360 BCE, an aging philosopher reached for his stylus and began to write what would become the most enduring mystery in Western literature. Plato was not young. He had founded his academy, had trained the mind that would tutor Alexander the Great, had composed dialogues that would shape philosophy for millennia to come. He had every reason to write with precision, every capacity to distinguish between allegory and history, every awareness that his words would be scrutinized by generations yet unborn. And yet what he wrote has confounded that scrutiny ever since. The story of Atlantis appears in two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, and in both, Plato insists, through his characters, that the account is true. Not symbolically true, not philosophically true, but historically true. This is no invented fable, says Critias, the character who relates the tale, but genuine history. The emphasis seems deliberate, seems designed to forestall the very interpretation that modern scholars have most often applied. The lineage of the story, as Plato presents it, stretches back through generations of careful transmission. Solon, the great Athenian lawgiver, traveled to Egypt around 600 BCE and visited the temple at Sais, where he encountered priests who claimed to possess records far older than any Greek archive. These priests, upon hearing Solon boast of Greek antiquity, gently corrected him. "Oh, Solon, Solon," one priest allegedly said, "you Greeks are always children. There is no old Greek." The Greeks, the priest explained, had suffered catastrophes that periodically erased their memory, leaving them to begin again without knowledge of what had come before. Egypt, protected by its geography, had preserved records through these destructions. Records that stretched back 9,000 years before Solon's visit. Records that contained the story of a great island empire beyond the pillars of Heracles, and the war it had waged against the ancestors of the very Greeks who had forgotten it occurred. We pause here to absorb the weight of this claim. 9,000 years before Solon's visit would place these events around 9600 BCE, more than 6,000 years before the earliest civilizations that conventional archaeology recognizes, before the cities of Mesopotamia arose, before the first pharaohs ruled Egypt, before writing itself had been invented. The time frame is staggering, is impossible by standard historical models, is precisely the kind of detail that forces interpreters to choose between dismissing Plato's account entirely and accepting that something is missing from our understanding of the deep past. Solon, we are told, intended to compose a great poem about Atlantis, but was prevented by other duties. He passed the story to his relative Dropides, who passed it to his son, also named Critias, who passed it to the Critias who appears in Plato's dialogue. The chain of transmission spans generations, creates distance between Plato himself and the original Egyptian source, allows for error while simultaneously providing the lineage that historical claims required in the ancient world. The story that Critias relates describes an island larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, situated in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the strait where Gibraltar now stands. This island served as a stepping stone to other islands and to a great continent beyond. A detail that has fascinated those who see in this description an awareness of the Americas that ancient peoples should not have possessed. On this island, Atlantis, there existed a civilization of remarkable sophistication. The god Poseidon had taken the island as his domain, had fallen in love with a mortal woman named Cleito, and had shaped the geography to protect her dwelling place. He carved alternating rings of sea and land around the central hill where she lived, creating concentric circles of water navigable by ships and land covered with buildings and gardens. The descendants of Poseidon and Cleito, 5 sets of twin sons, became the rulers of Atlantis, with the eldest, Atlas, giving his name to both the island and the surrounding ocean. These 10 kings governed their respective portions while maintaining unity through laws that Poseidon himself had established. Laws inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum in the temple at the island's center. Plato describes the wealth of Atlantis in detail that seems excessive for mere allegory. The forests supplied wood for countless buildings. The earth yielded metals, including the mysterious orichalcum that gleamed like fire and was valued second only to gold. Elephants roamed in abundance, a detail that has puzzled interpreters, since elephants are not native to any location in the Atlantic. Fruits and flowers grew in profusion The climate was mild, the harbours accommodated ships from across the known world. The precision of these descriptions has sustained the search for Atlantis across centuries. If Plato intended only to create a political thought experiment, why include such specific geography? Why describe the dimensions of the canals, the arrangement of the harbours, the types of stone used in construction? Why invent elephants and orichalcum and a metal-rich earth that bears no resemblance to the Greek landscape his readers knew? The Critias dialogue begins to describe the ancient Athens that would eventually defeat Atlantis, an Athens that predates any Athens that history records, a city whose inhabitants lived simply and virtuously, who had not yet developed the sophistication that would come later, who possessed the martial excellence that allowed them to stand alone against the Atlantean invasion. This ancient Athens, like Atlantis itself, was destroyed in the catastrophe that ended the war, leaving no trace except in Egyptian records. Then the dialogue stops. The Critias breaks off mid-sentence, incomplete. Plato never finished the account, never described the final war in detail, never narrated the catastrophe that destroyed both civilizations. The greatest mystery may be this incompleteness, whether Plato died before finishing, whether he chose to leave the story suspended, whether some portion of the text was lost to the same forces of decay that claim all ancient documents eventually. The silence at the end of Critias echoes through the centuries. We are left with the setup, but not the resolution, with the description of paradise, but not the full account of its fall, with questions that Plato himself refused or was unable to answer. We rest now in the space that his words have created, the Atlantis that exists in the Timaeus and Critias, neither more nor less than what Plato chose to reveal. The interpretations will multiply in chapters to come. The locations will be proposed and disputed. The debates will continue as they have continued since the Academy first discussed what the founder had written. But the words remain. The precision remains. The insistence on truth remains. An aging philosopher, in the amber light of an Athenian evening, wrote what he claimed was history. He described an island empire of staggering wealth and sophistication. He placed it in an age before memory, in waters beyond the known world, in a story he received from priests who claimed to count time in scales that Greeks could not imagine. The words have waited 24 centuries for readers who might understand them. Perhaps they are waiting still. Perhaps the understanding lies not in solving the mystery, but in learning to dwell within it, to let the questions deepen rather than demanding answers that may not exist, to receive what Plato offered without insisting that we know better than he did what he intended to convey. The philosopher whispered to the ages. The ages are still listening, and somewhere in the silence between his words and our understanding, Atlantis waits, as it has always waited, as perhaps it always will. The ancient world had edges. Beyond certain points, the known yielded to the unknown. The mapped gave way to the unmappable, and sailors who ventured too far might find themselves in waters where the rules of ordinary existence no longer applied. The most significant of these edges for the Mediterranean peoples who would shape Western civilization, stood at the narrow strait where the inland sea met the vast Atlantic beyond. The Pillars of Heracles. We know them now as the Rock of Gibraltar on the European side and either Monte Hacho or Jebel Musa on the African coast, geographical features that frame the passage between the Mediterranean and the ocean beyond. But for the ancients, these were more than geographical features. They were the markers of a boundary, the posts of a gate, the threshold between the world that could be known and the void that refused knowing. Plato placed Atlantis specifically beyond this threshold. Not in the Mediterranean, where Greek ships regularly sailed, where colonies dotted the coastlines, where trade routes had been established for centuries. Beyond the Pillars, in the Atlantic, in the waters that Homer had called the river ocean, the great stream that encircled the earth, the realm of mystery and danger and divine power. The choice of location was significant in ways that modern readers may not immediately appreciate. To an Athenian audience, placing a civilization beyond the Pillars was akin to placing it in another dimension, accessible in theory, but separated by a boundary that carried profound symbolic weight. Ships could pass through the strait, and some certainly did, but what lay beyond remained largely unknown. A canvas upon which imagination could paint whatever it wished. The Phoenicians knew these waters better than most. From their cities along the Levantine coast, they had established colonies throughout the Mediterranean and eventually beyond, reaching the Atlantic shores of Iberia and Africa. Cadiz, which they founded, lies just beyond the Pillars, and their ships are believed to have ventured as far as Britain in search of tin and perhaps even farther in voyages that left no clear historical record. But the Phoenicians were famously secretive about their trade routes. The knowledge they possessed was commercial advantage, not to be shared with competitors. The silence they maintained about Atlantic navigation contributed to the mystery that surrounded those waters. The sense that whatever lay beyond the Pillars was hidden not merely by distance but by deliberate concealment. The Carthaginians, heirs to Phoenician maritime tradition, reportedly maintained this secrecy with ruthless efficiency. Ancient sources claim that Carthaginian captains would deliberately wreck their ships rather than allow competitors to follow them to Atlantic destinations. Whether or not these accounts are accurate, they reflect the perception that the Atlantic held secrets that some were willing to protect at any cost. Into this context of mystery and deliberate obscurity, Plato inserted his island empire. He did not place Atlantis at the edge of the known world, but beyond it, in waters that his readers associated with the unknown, the forbidden, the divine. The Pillars of Heracles were not merely geographical markers in his account, but boundary posts, gates that separated the familiar Mediterranean world from something older and stranger. The name itself invokes divinity. Heracles, Hercules to the Romans, was the hero who had labored at the edges of the possible, who had descended to the underworld, who had reached the limits of the earth in his quest for the golden apples of the Hesperides. The pillars that bore his name marked the point of his furthest journey, the boundary he had reached and thereby defined. To pass beyond the pillars was to follow in the footsteps of Heracles, to venture where only heroes and gods had gone before. The boundary was psychological as much as physical, was wrapped in associations of danger and mystery and the divine. The Atlantic itself was understood differently than the Mediterranean. The inland sea was, for all its storms and hazards, a navigable body of water, whose shores were known and whose moods could be predicted. The Atlantic was something else, a vast expanse that disappeared over the horizon, whose far shore, if it had one, lay beyond any confirmed voyage, whose depths were unknown, and whose surface was believed to behave differently than the waters Greeks knew. Some ancient sources spoke of a thick, muddy region in the Atlantic where ships could not pass, a detail that resonates strangely with Plato's claim that the site of sunken Atlantis remained impassable due to shoals of mud. Whether this represented actual experience of shallow waters, seaweed-choked areas like the Sargasso Sea, or simple imagination applied to unknown space, the perception contributed to the Atlantic's reputation as a sea of obstacles and mysteries. Beyond the pillars, the world grew strange. Islands appeared and disappeared in the mist. Waters behaved in unexpected ways. The sun set into an ocean that might extend forever or might end at some unimaginable boundary. Where sky met water and existence itself grew uncertain. Plato's Atlantis existed in this space of uncertainty. Not in the Mediterranean where it could theoretically be checked against Greek knowledge, but in the Atlantic where imagination had room to operate, where distances could be as vast as the story required, where a civilization could rise and fall and leave no trace that contradictory evidence might disprove. This placement was either brilliant narrative strategy or honest reporting, depending on one's interpretation of Plato's intent. If he invented Atlantis, placing it beyond the pillars protected the invention from immediate falsification. If he was recording genuine tradition, the location explained why Greeks knew nothing of the island. It had existed in waters they did not regularly sail, had been destroyed before their maritime reach extended beyond the familiar sea. We stand now in imagination at the ancient pillars, feeling the currents that flow through the strait, watching the waters of the Mediterranean mingle with the waters of the Atlantic, sensing the weight of meaning that this threshold carried for those who understood geography in symbolic as well as physical terms. Beyond this point, memory fades. The records that might confirm or deny Atlantis' existence, if they ever existed, belong to peoples who did not transmit their knowledge to Greek historians. The Egyptians claim to remember, but Egyptian records as we know them contain no clear reference to Atlantis. The Phoenicians might have known, but their secrets were kept too well or lost entirely when Carthage fell. The pillars stand as markers of our ignorance as much as markers of geography. They remind us that the ancient world was smaller than our own, that vast regions lay beyond the reach of the civilizations whose records survive, that the known was always surrounded by the unknown, and the unknown has mostly remained unknown despite our expanded maps and satellite imagery. What lies beyond the pillars in truth? An ocean, islands, continents that ancient peoples may or may not have reached. But what lies beyond the pillars in memory and imagination? The space where Atlantis dwells, where golden ages are always possible because they cannot be disproven, where the past might contain wonders that no present evidence can confirm. We close this meditation as ancient sailors might have closed their days, watching the sun descend toward western waters, wondering what lay in the direction it traveled, knowing that some boundaries exist to be crossed and others exist to remind us that not all crossings are possible. The pillars have stood for ages beyond counting. Beyond them, in waters we think we know but perhaps do not, the mystery persists. Memory fades in those depths, but something else perhaps remembers what memory has lost. In the temple shadows of Sais, where columns rose like frozen rivers toward ceilings lost in darkness, where incense smoke curled through shafts of light that penetrated from high windows, there existed, or so Plato's account claims, archives that stretched back further than Greek imagination could comfortably contain. 9,000 years before Solon's visit, 9,000 years of records maintained by priests who understood their role as keepers of memory for a world that repeatedly forgot itself. The Greeks who traveled to Egypt recognized immediately that they were encountering something older than their own civilization. Older by scales that made Greek antiquity seem like recent news. The pyramids at Giza were already more than 2,000 years old when Solon arrived, were as ancient to him as the Roman Empire is to us. The temples contained inscriptions in scripts that had been written before the ancestors of Greeks had emerged from whatever obscurity preceded their arrival in the Aegean. Egyptian priests cultivated this sense of antiquity, maintained traditions of cosmic time that dwarf the genealogies the Greeks used to measure their past, where Greeks counted generations. Grandfather, great-grandfather, the heroes of Troy, the gods beyond them. Egyptian priests counted dynasties, counted ages of the world, counted the reigns of gods upon earth before human pharaohs took the throne. The encounter between Solon and the Egyptian priests, as Plato describes it, dramatizes this collision of temporal frameworks. Solon, a wise man by Greek standards, an honored lawgiver whose reforms had shaped Athenian society, arrived in Egypt expecting to share knowledge with other wise men. He began to speak of Greek antiquity, of Phoroneus, who was said to be the first man, of Niobe, of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survived the flood. The priests listened. Then one of them, whom Plato describes as very old, delivered the gentle correction that would frame the Atlantis narrative. The Greeks, he said, remembered only the most recent of many floods and destructions. They knew nothing of what had happened before, because each catastrophe erased their memory and forced them to be again like children. Egypt had escaped these periodic destructions, or rather had preserved records through them because of its unique geography. The Nile did not depend on rainfall that might cease during global catastrophes. The desert that surrounded the narrow, fertile valley protected it from invasions that devastated other lands. What was lost elsewhere was preserved along the Nile, inscribed in the stone that the desert kept dry. The claim is extraordinary. The priest is asserting that Egypt possessed continuous written records for at least 9,000 years, that it had documented events of which other civilizations retained only distorted myths. that it served as humanity's memory when humanity itself forgot. Modern scholarship does not support such claims in their literal form. Egyptian records, extensive as they are, do not reach back 9,000 years before Solon. They do not contain clear references to Atlantis. They do not describe a war between an Atlantic empire and prehistoric Athens. Whatever the priests at Sais may have told Solon, the records they claim to possess have not survived in any form that archaeology can verify. And yet the claim resonates with something true about Egypt's relationship to time. The civilization that built the pyramids did possess historical consciousness of remarkable depth. The king lists that traced pharaonic succession back through dynasties, the mythological frameworks that extended history into ages of divine rule, the inscriptions that commemorated events centuries old as though they had just occurred, all testified to a culture that took the preservation of memory seriously, that understood its role as keeper of records for ages that other peoples had forgotten. The priests of Sais, if they existed as Plato described them, inhabited a tradition that valued the long view. They thought in centuries and millennia, not in the decades that Greek political life emphasized. They maintained archives not for immediate practical use, but for the preservation of knowledge that might be needed by generations not yet born. They understood themselves as links in a chain that stretched back to the beginning of things and would continue until the end. What might such priests have preserved? What memories might have survived in temple archives that were ancient before the Greeks arrived in the Aegean? The questions cannot be answered with certainty, but they can be contemplated. The deep past is not empty. Before the civilizations that history records, human beings were building, creating, perhaps achieving things that have left no trace in the archaeological record. The end of the last ice age, around the time that Plato's chronology places the destruction of Atlantis, was a period of dramatic environmental change. Rising sea levels, shifting coastlines, the drowning of lands that had been inhabited during the glacial maximum. What was lost beneath those rising waters? What might have existed on continental shelves and now submerged? On islands now vanished? In regions that climate change transformed beyond recognition? The priests of Sais, if they possessed genuine ancient records, might have preserved memories of such lost worlds. They might have maintained traditions that other cultures had forgotten, stories that had been transmitted through the catastrophes that erased other archives. The claim is not impossible, merely unverifiable, which is perhaps the most frustrating category of historical claim, neither confirmed nor refuted, simply unknown. We descend now in imagination into the temple at Sais, into the chambers where the archives were kept, into the sacred space where priests maintain their vigil over records they believe stretched back to the beginning of human memory. The light is dim here, filtered through small high windows, softened by smoke from lamps that burn perpetually. The walls are covered with hieroglyphs, texts we cannot read in this imagined space. Texts that might contain what Solon heard, or might contain something entirely different. The priests move among the records with the familiarity of long practice. They know where each scroll is stored, which inscriptions contain which accounts, how the information is organized across chambers and collections. They have dedicated their lives to this preservation, have accepted that their role is not to create new knowledge, but to maintain old knowledge against the forces of forgetting. One priest, the very old one whom Plato mentions, sits in conversation with a Greek visitor. The Greek is brilliant by the standards of his civilization, a lawgiver and poet, a man respected throughout the Mediterranean world. But in this place, surrounded by records that predate everything he knows, the Greek is the student and the priest is the teacher. You Greeks are always children, the priest says. There is no old Greek. The words echo through the temple, through the centuries, through the mystery of what the priests knew and what they have failed to transmit. The records they guarded have been lost to conquest, to decay, to the same forces of forgetting that they believed their archives could withstand. If they possessed knowledge of Atlantis, that knowledge died with them or with the documents they maintained. But the claim persists. The tradition survives. The assertion that Egypt knew what others had forgotten continues to invite wonder and speculation. We close this meditation in the temple shadows, among records we cannot read, in the presence of priests who have been dead for millennia. The knowledge they kept has been scattered, has been lost, has been buried beneath layers of time that even their counting could not have anticipated. But somewhere in that buried knowledge, perhaps, the truth about Atlantis rests. The priests kept the old accounting. What they counted, only they knew. And what they knew has passed beyond our reach into the silence, where only echoes remain. The image emerges from Plato's words like a vision rising from morning mist. An island shaped by divine hands, carved into concentric circles of water and land, arranged with geometric precision that speaks of intention beyond human capability. At the center, a hill where a mortal woman once lived, protected by a god who loved her. Around that hill, rings of sea and rings of land, alternating outward until the whole formed a pattern that mystics would later recognize in mandalas, in sacred geometries, in the archetypal images that appear across cultures when humans try to represent perfection. Poseidon created this arrangement according to Plato's account. The god of the sea took Atlantis as his portion when the gods divided the earth among themselves. And on the island he found Plato, a mortal woman whose parents had died, who lived alone on a hill, surrounded by the natural beauty that the island provided. Poseidon desired her, and to protect her, and perhaps to possess her, he reshaped the geography around her dwelling. The description that follows is remarkable in its precision. 2 rings of land and 3 of sea surrounded the central island, each carefully measured. The outer ring of sea was 3 stadia wide. The inner ring of land was 3 stadia. The next ring of sea was 2 stadia. The innermost ring of land was 2 stadia. And the central island itself was 5 stadia in diameter. A stadion was roughly 185 meters, making the entire complex approximately 23 kilometers across. A vast construction, but not impossibly so. not obviously mythical in scale. The rings of sea were deep enough for ships to sail through, and the Atlanteans had carved tunnels through the rings of land to allow vessels to reach the central island. Bridges spanned the water rings, creating roadways that connected the concentric zones. The engineering was sophisticated, suggesting a civilization capable of large-scale construction projects, of moving earth and stone to reshape their environment according to a unified plan. On the central island stood the Temple of Poseidon, the spiritual heart of the entire civilization. Plato describes this temple in detail that seems excessive for mere allegory. A building a stadium long, half a stadium wide, with a height proportionate to its length. The exterior was covered in silver, except for the pinnacles, which gleamed with gold. The interior was lined with ivory, decorated with gold and silver and orichalcum, that mysterious metal that appears nowhere else in ancient literature with such significance. Within the temple stood a statue of Poseidon, driving 6 winged horses, so large that his head touched the ceiling. Around him were arranged 100 Nereids riding dolphins. Again, a specific number, a precise arrangement, details that seemed designed to convince rather than merely to illustrate. The orichalcum that covered the temple walls deserves particular attention. This metal, which Plato says was valued second only to gold, has never been certainly identified. The name means roughly mountain copper or copper of the mountain, but the description of its fire-like gleam suggests something more exotic than ordinary copper alloys. Some scholars have proposed that it was a gold-copper alloy. Others have suggested amber or some natural mineral. Still others believe Plato invented it entirely to emphasize Atlantis' otherworldly abundance. Whatever it was, orichalcum covered not just the temple, but much of the inner citadel, creating walls that would have blazed in sunlight with colors no visitor would have seen elsewhere. The visual effect must have been overwhelming. A city of metal and stone rising from rings of water. Every surface gleaming, every structure speaking of wealth and power beyond ordinary comprehension. The descriptions continue outward through the concentric zones. The ring of land closest to the center was covered with palaces and temples, with the dwellings of the kings and the structures necessary for divine worship. The outer ring of land contained the racecourse where horses competed, a track running around the entire circumference of the ring, wide enough for charioteers to race without collision. Beyond the rings, covering the main body of the island, stretched agricultural lands of legendary fertility. The soil produced 2 harvests per year, one from rainfall and one from irrigation systems that channeled the island's abundant water. Fruits and grains grew in profusion, supporting a population that Plato numbers in the millions, far exceeding the populations of Greek city-states. The hot and cold springs that Poseidon had caused to flow from the central hill provided water for bathing. Not merely practical bathing, but elaborate ritual bathing with separate facilities for kings and commoners, for men and women, and even for horses. The Atlanteans, it seems, valued cleanliness and luxury in combination, had developed a culture of bathing that rivaled or exceeded what the Romans would later create. The forests supplied timber for the endless construction projects. The quarries provided stone in 3 colors, black, white, and red, that the builders combined to create visual effects both pleasing and symbolic. The docks accommodated hundreds of triremes, the warships that would eventually carry Atlantean armies toward the Mediterranean world. All of this Plato describes with the patience of a chronicler recording what he believes to be real, or with the skill of a novelist creating a world that readers will inhabit fully. The distinction matters to scholars who debate Plato's intentions, but it may matter less to those who simply wish to contemplate what he created. A vision of a civilization at once familiar and strange, recognizable as human achievement, yet exceeding what any human civilization of Plato's time had accomplished. The rings of Atlantis have their parallels in other sacred geographies. The circular cities of Persian tradition, the mandala designs of Indian cosmology, the concentric heavens of medieval imagination. The pattern speaks of order imposed on chaos, of divine intelligence structuring the raw material of creation, of the cosmos itself reflected in the organization of human space. We stand now in imagination at the outer edge of the rings, looking inward toward the central island and its gleaming temple. Ships move through the water rings, carrying goods and passengers through the tunnels that pierce the land rings. Bridges span the waters, and on those bridges people walk. Priests in ceremonial robes, warriors in gleaming armor, merchants and craftsmen and slaves, the whole population of a civilization that existed or was imagined before history as we know it began. The water reflects the sky, reflects the buildings that rise from the rings of land, reflects images that double and shimmer in the gentle movement of the contained sea. Fish swim in waters that engineering has tamed, that divine intervention has shaped, that human labor has maintained across generations. The system works because it was designed to work, because the God who created it understood what human needs required and provided for those needs in a form that was both functional and beautiful. We close this meditation as the sun sets over the rings, as the orichalcum catches the last light and blazes with color that seems to come from within the metal itself, as the whole structure glows briefly with a radiance that makes the divine origin credible, that justifies the reverence the Atlanteans felt for the place and the God who had made it. The vision fades as visions must. The rings return to words on a page, to the description that Plato left incomplete, to the mystery of whether such a place ever existed or was always only a dream of perfection that the waking world could never sustain. The island of rings and sacred waters, the pattern that suggests order beyond human capability, the dream of civilization at its apex. It waits in the words where Plato left it, neither proven nor disproven, neither completely imagined nor completely real. The rings remain, the mystery remains, and somewhere in the space between history and imagination, the sacred waters still reflect what once stood on their shores. Every 5th and 6th year, when the celestial signs aligned in the pattern that tradition prescribed, the 10 kings of Atlantis gathered in the temple at the island's heart. They came from their separate domains, from the portions of the island and the surrounding lands that their ancestors had received when Poseidon divided the kingdom among his 10 sons. They came to judge one another, to renew their oaths, to perform the rituals that bound them together across the distances that otherwise separated their reigns. The gathering occurred at night, by torchlight, in the innermost sanctuary of Poseidon's temple. The darkness was intentional, was part of the ritual's meaning. The kings put aside the daylight world of ordinary rule and entered a sacred time where different laws applied, where the presence of the god who had founded their dynasty could be felt more directly than in the common light of day. Before the judgment could occur, there was the hunt. The bulls of Poseidon roamed freely in the temple precincts, sacred animals that could not be confined or domesticated, that represented the wild power of the god who had taken the form of a bull in ancient myths. The kings pursued these bulls without weapons of iron, using only staves and nooses, a restriction that connected the ritual to an age before iron was common, that preserved the memory of earlier times when copper and bronze were the metals of power. The hunt was dangerous. The bulls were not tame creatures participating in a formalized pageant, but actual wild animals, powerful and unpredictable, capable of killing a king as easily as being captured by one. The danger was part of the meaning. The kings proved their worthiness through genuine risk, demonstrated their right to rule through ability that could not be faked or substituted. When a bull was captured, it was led to the pillar at the temple's center, the pillar of orichalcum on which Poseidon himself had inscribed the laws that governed Atlantis. At the top of this pillar were written not only the laws, but also an oath, the pledge that the 10 kings renewed each time they gathered, the words that bound them to one another, and to the divine authority from which their power derived. The bull's throat was cut over the pillar, and its blood flowed down over the inscribed laws. A literal baptism of the covenant in sacrificial blood, a renewal that was physical and visceral rather than merely verbal. The kings mixed this blood with wine in a sacred bowl, drew portions for each of themselves, poured libations to Poseidon, and drank what remained. The blood of the sacred animal flowed through their veins, united them in a bond that transcended ordinary political alliance. Then the judgment occurred. Wearing robes of deep blue, the color of the sea, the color of their divine ancestors' domain, the king sat through the night examining whatever accusations had been brought against any of their number. They judged according to the laws on the pillar, laws that Poseidon had established, laws that the kings themselves could not change without unanimous consent. These laws were strict in their requirements and unusual in their emphases. No king could take up arms against another of the royal house. No king could give aid to anyone warring against a fellow king. All decisions of common concern required the participation of all 10, meeting in the council that the gathering represented. The king who held the senior position, the descendant of Atlas, had special authority, but could not execute any member of the royal house without the consent of the majority. The laws were designed to maintain unity, to prevent the fragmentation that ambitious rulers so often caused, to ensure that the division of the kingdom among 10 sons did not lead to the conflicts that similar divisions had produced elsewhere. The religious character of the gathering reinforced the political requirements. To violate the covenant was to offend not merely fellow kings, but the God who had established the terms of cooperation. The judgment continued through the night, and at dawn the kings inscribed their decisions on tablets of gold. These tablets were then stored in the temple, creating an archive of royal decisions that accumulated across generations, preserving the legal history of the kingdom as the Egyptian temples were said to preserve the broader history of the world. The ritual complete, the kings removed their robes and retired to rest. They would remain in the central island for a time, renewing personal bonds that distance had loosened, participating in games and feasts and the ordinary activities of royal hospitality. Then they would return to their separate domains, carrying with them the renewed covenant that would govern their relationships until the next gathering. This system persisted for ages, for generations beyond counting. If the Egyptian chronology was accurate, for millennia, during which the descendants of Poseidon ruled in accordance with divine law. The kingdom prospered under this arrangement. The abundance of the island supported an enormous population. The trade relationships with surrounding lands brought wealth from across the known world. The military power that 10 coordinated kingdoms could deploy exceeded what any single realm could match. But nothing lasts forever. Nothing human, at least, escapes the decay that time inflicts on all mortal arrangements. The divine blood that flowed in the veins of the kings, Plato tells us, eventually grew diluted. Generation after generation, the portion that came from Poseidon diminished, while the portion that came from mortal ancestors increased. The kings began to change, began to value wealth over virtue, began to pursue expansion rather than contentment, began to see the laws on the orichalcum pillar as constraints rather than guides. They appeared unseemly, Plato writes, to those who had eyes to see, having lost the fairest of their precious gifts. The transformation was visible only to those with spiritual discernment. To others, the kings seemed as glorious as ever, perhaps more glorious since their wealth and power continued to increase. But the inequality that had made their rule legitimate was fading, was dissolving into the mortal nature that would eventually claim them entirely. The gatherings continued. The rituals were performed. The bulls were hunted and sacrificed. The blood was mixed with wine. The judgments were rendered. But the meaning drained from the ceremonies became formality without substance, became tradition without understanding. The kings went through the motions of what their ancestors had done with conviction, preserving the outer form while the inner reality disappeared. And somewhere, watching from whatever vantage the divine occupy, Zeus noticed. The king of gods, who presided over justice and the proper order of things, saw what Atlantis was becoming and resolved to act. He gathered all the gods into their most honored abode, Plato writes, which stands at the center of the universe and sees all things that participate in becoming. And when he had gathered them together, he said, "The dialogue breaks off. We never learn what Zeus said, what judgment he pronounced, what fate he decreed for the island that had fallen from its former glory." The Critias stops mid-sentence. leaving the divine decision forever unknown. We close this meditation in the torchlight of the final gathering, among kings who no longer understand what they are doing, who perform rituals whose meaning has been lost, who cannot see what those with eyes to see perceive clearly, that the end is approaching, that divine patience has been exhausted, that the waters are about to rise. The torches gutter in the darkness. The kings drink blood-mixed wine. And Zeus prepares to speak words that Plato never recorded. The silence that follows is absolute. Before the flood came the war, the conflict that Plato describes as the reason the story was preserved, the occasion that gave Athens a role in events otherwise remote from Greek memory. In an age before history as Greeks understood it, when ancestors they could not name lived in a city they would not recognize, Atlantis launched its invasion of the Mediterranean world, and Athens alone stood against the assault. The Atlantean Empire, by this time, had grown beyond its island origins. The 10 kingdoms controlled not merely Atlantis itself, but the surrounding lands and islands, had expanded to include portions of Libya as far as Egypt and portions of Europe as far as Tyrrhenia. The wealth that the island's abundance provided had been converted into military power. The coordination that the King's Covenant ensured had been directed toward conquest. The ambition that had replaced virtue in the royal blood sought to bring the entire known world under Atlantean dominion. The invasion came through the Pillars of Heracles, came like a storm from the Atlantic that the Mediterranean peoples had not anticipated. The Atlantean armies were vast, were equipped with the wealth that their homeland provided, were led by kings who had forgotten that law and limit were divine requirements. They conquered as they came, swept aside the peoples who dwelt along the western Mediterranean shores, established control over territories that would later become familiar to Greek historians under other names. The peoples within the pillars could not stand against this assault. One after another, kingdoms fell or submitted, chose surrender over annihilation, accepted Atlantean dominion as the price of survival. The wave rolled eastward, and nothing seemed capable of stopping it. Nothing except Athens. The Athens of this age, 9,000 years before Solon's time, according to the Egyptian reckoning, bore little resemblance to the city that Plato knew. It was not yet the Athens of philosophers and playwrights, of democracy and artistic achievement. It was a simple martial community, governed by a warrior class that valued courage and virtue above the sophistication that would come later. Its people lived frugally, owned little, and trained for combat as the primary duty of citizenship. This ancient Athens, Plato tells us, led the resistance against Atlantis. When other peoples faltered, when allies withdrew or were defeated, the Athenians stood firm. They gathered beneath their banners all who would still resist, all who refused Atlantean dominion, all who believed that some pure in the world could match the force that poured through the pillars. The war that followed is not described in detail. The Critias breaks off before the narrative reaches this point, and the Timaeus mentions it only briefly. We know its outcome. Athens prevailed. The Atlantean invasion was thrown back. The peoples who had been enslaved were liberated. The threat from beyond the pillars was defeated. But we do not know how. We do not know what battles were fought, what strategies were employed, what heroes rose to lead the resistance. The war exists in Plato's account as fact without narrative, as outcome without process, as victory whose details have been lost even though its consequence was preserved. The mystery deepens when we consider what happened afterward. The Egyptians who preserved this history, who told it to Solon, who maintained records that stretched back 9,000 years. They remembered that Athens had won, but the Athenians themselves remembered nothing. The catastrophe that followed the war erased Greek memory as thoroughly as it erased Atlantis itself. For both civilizations fell. The victors and the vanquished alike were destroyed in the events that followed the war, were swallowed by earthquakes and floods that made no distinction between those who had attacked and those who had defended. The ancient Athens that had stood against Atlantis disappeared as completely as Atlantis itself, leaving only the Egyptian record to testify that it had ever existed. This is perhaps the strangest element of Plato's account. The suggestion that the catastrophe was not punishment for Atlantean aggression alone, but something that affected the entire world, that destroyed the virtuous along with the corrupt, that erased memory on both sides of the conflict. The war that heaven remembered was remembered only in heaven. Those who had fought it forgot entirely, began again as children, reconstructed their civilizations without knowledge of what had come before. What are we to make of such a claim? If Plato intended allegory, the meaning seems clear enough. Virtue and corruption alike are swept away by time, and even the greatest achievements are eventually forgotten. But if he intended history, if the Egyptian priests truly possessed such records, then we are faced with the possibility that catastrophic events have repeatedly reset human civilization, that our history is merely the most recent chapter of a longer story, that ages of achievement have preceded our own and left no trace except in the archives of those who knew how to preserve memory through destruction. The war that heaven remembered invites us to consider what else heaven might remember that we have forgotten. The divine perspective, if such a perspective exists, would encompass all of human history, not merely the portion we have recorded. From that vantage, the rise and fall of civilizations might appear as a recurring pattern, as cycles of achievement and catastrophe that repeat with variations, as the same story told again and again by actors who believe themselves unique. We stand now in imagination on the battlefield where Athens face Atlantis, a location we cannot name, in an age we cannot date, among warriors whose names have been lost. The Atlantean forces are vast, are confident, are backed by the wealth and power of an empire that has conquered everything it has faced. The Athenian forces are small, are simple, are sustained by nothing except the conviction that some things are worth dying to defend. The battle unfolds in ways we cannot know. Spears are thrown, swords are drawn, the clash of armies sends sound across the landscape that no human ear has heard for 10,000 years. Somewhere in that chaos, the tide turns. Somewhere in that violence, the defenders prevail. the Atlantean invasion breaks against Athenian resistance, and the wave that seemed unstoppable recedes back toward the pillars. But the victory is hollow. The victors will not survive to enjoy what they have preserved. The catastrophe that follows will take them as surely as it takes their defeated enemies. The war will be forgotten by those who fought it, remembered only by priests in a distant land who inscribed what they knew on temple walls. We close this meditation as the war ends and the catastrophe approaches. As the soldiers who have survived the battle look up at skies that are beginning to change, as the earth beneath their feet begins to tremble with warnings of what is to come. Heaven remembered, the earth forgot, and between heaven and earth the war exists now, only in the words that Plato recorded and the mystery that surrounds them. The soldiers rest, not knowing they will never wake. The waters gather, preparing to rise, and the memory passes from human keeping into whatever archive preserves what humans lose. It came in a single day and night. Whatever warnings preceded it, whatever signs the priests might have read in the heavens, whatever omens the seers might have interpreted, the end itself was swift. The earth opened, the waters rose. The island that had threatened to conquer the world vanished beneath the waves that closed over it like a curtain drawn across a stage. Plato's description is brief but terrible. In a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared in the depths of the sea. The phrase single day and night carries weight beyond its literal meaning. In ancient Greek usage, this could indicate a period of approximately 24 hours. But it also suggests sudden totality, not the gradual subsidence that might unfold over years, but catastrophic collapse, the kind of destruction that leaves no time for flight or preparation. The earth opened first, or perhaps simultaneously with the rising sea. Earthquakes swallowed the warriors of ancient Athens, who had just achieved their greatest victory and would not survive to remember it. The ground that had supported their city, their homes, their lives simply gave way, taking everything built upon it into depths from which nothing would return. Across the water, beyond the pillars, similar destruction was unfolding on a vaster scale. The island of Atlantis, with its concentric rings and gleaming temples, with its harbours full of ships and its plains covered with the abundance of 2 annual harvests, all of it was descending. The waters that Poseidon had shaped into rings of navigation were merging with the waters of the surrounding sea. The walls that had gleamed with orichalcum were tumbling. The temple where the kings had gathered by torchlight was falling into darkness that no torch would ever again illuminate. The people. What of the people? Plato does not describe their experience, does not narrate the terror that must have accompanied such destruction. The millions who lived on the island and its surrounding territories, the kings who had ruled, the priests who had served, the merchants and farmers and soldiers who had built their lives within the Atlantean system, they vanish from the account in a single sentence, become the unnamed casualties of divine judgment. We can imagine, though Plato does not describe, the initial tremors that might have seemed ordinary, the rumbles that grew into roars, the moment of recognition when it became clear that this was not a normal earthquake, but something beyond all experience. The rush towards ships that would never reach safe harbor. The prayers to Poseidon that the god who had built this civilization might spare it. The final moments when the waters closed over those who had not escaped and over those who had tried to escape and failed. The catastrophe extended beyond Atlantis itself. The entire Mediterranean world was affected. The coastlines reshaped, the populations decimated, the memory of what had been erased along with the civilizations that had maintained it. Only Egypt survived sufficiently intact to preserve records protected by the unique geography that kept the Nile flowing when other waters had become instruments of destruction. The parallel with flood myths is inescapable. Every ancient culture preserved stories of waters that rose to destroy a corrupt world, of survivors who carried forward what could be saved, of humanity beginning again in the aftermath of a divine judgment. The biblical flood, the Mesopotamian stories of Utnapishtim, the Greek legends of Deucalion, all speak of catastrophe by water, of the cleansing that the rising sea represents, of the world remade after the old world proved unworthy of continuation. Plato's account fits this pattern while also distinguishing itself. The Atlantis catastrophe is not universal in the way that the biblical flood is universal. It destroys specific civilizations rather than all life on Earth. But it is comprehensive enough to reset the historical clock, to create a before and after that divides the ages, to bury the old world so thoroughly that only fragments of memory survive. Modern scholars have proposed various natural catastrophes that might underlie the Atlantis legend. The eruption of Thera around 1600 BCE devastated Minoan civilization and may have generated tsunamis that affected the entire eastern Mediterranean. The end of the last ice age, around the time that Plato's chronology suggests, saw dramatic rises in sea level as glaciers melted, rises that drowned coastlines and might have swallowed civilizations that had developed in now submerged regions. None of these proposals perfectly matches Plato's description. Thera's eruption was catastrophic but regional, and occurred far more recently than the 9,000-year timeframe suggests. The Ice Age flooding was real but gradual, unfolding over centuries rather than in a single night. The search for a natural explanation that satisfies all the criteria of Plato's account has not yet succeeded, which may mean that the account is fiction, or may mean that we have not yet found the right explanation. We stand now in imagination as the waters rise, as the last towers of Atlantis slip beneath the surface, as the rings that Poseidon shaped fill with the ocean that will cover them forever. The sound is overwhelming, the roar of collapsing structures, the thunder of earthquakes that continue even as the flooding advances, the screams of those caught in destruction they cannot escape. Then the sound fades as the waters cover even the noise of catastrophe, as silence descends over the place where a civilization had stood. The sea grows calm. The surface that had been churned by the destruction settles into ordinary waves. Nothing remains above the water to indicate what lies below. Only the persistent shallows that Plato mentions, the shoals of mud that will prevent navigation for generations, the changed character of the Atlantic that sailors will notice without understanding its cause. The stars shine down on waters that have swallowed what they were meant to preserve. The temples, the palaces, the records of a civilization that had reached heights we can only imagine. The same stars that the Atlantean priests had studied, that the kings had watched from their towers, now illuminate nothing but empty ocean. The night passes. Dawn comes over a changed world. The survivors, those in distant regions who escaped the destruction, will begin the long process of reconstructing what can be reconstructed. But they will not remember Atlantis. They will not know what has been lost. The waters that rose in the night will keep their secret, will guard the drowned island against all discovery, will preserve the mystery that Plato would eventually record. We close this meditation as the last ripples from the catastrophe spread outward and fade, as the sea that claimed Atlantis returns to its ancient rhythms, as the silence that follows destruction deepens into the silence of the ages. The thunder has passed. The waters have risen. And beneath the surface where no light reaches, the island waits, neither destroyed in the way that destruction is usually understood, nor preserved in any way that preservation can access. The night of thunder and the rising sea. It came. It ended. And nothing that came after would remember what had been. When the waters finally stilled, when the convulsions that had swallowed Atlantis ceased, the destruction left traces that the ocean could not entirely conceal. Plato writes at the site where the island had sunk become impassable to sailors. Shoals of mud-blocked navigation prevented ships from crossing the region where the great civilization had stood. The sea itself seemed to guard what it had claimed, to maintain a barrier between the drowned kingdom and those who might seek to reach it. This detail has puzzled interpreters across centuries. How could the sinking of an island create shoals? How could destruction produce shallows? The physical mechanics seem backward. If Atlantis sank into the depths, the water above it should have been deep, not shallow. The mud that Plato describes suggests something other than simple submergence, suggests geological processes that we cannot easily reconstruct. Some scholars have proposed that volcanic material might explain the phenomenon, ash and debris from eruptions that accompanied the destruction, spreading across the surface and creating the impassable conditions Plato describes. Others have suggested that what sank was not the island itself, but the land bridge or shallow regions surrounding it, leaving the remaining water thick with sediment from the collapse. Still others have noted that the Sargasso Sea in the Atlantic, where some place Atlantis, is characterized by seaweed accumulation that impedes navigation, a natural phenomenon that ancient sailors might have interpreted as evidence of something catastrophic. The truth cannot be determined from the evidence we possess, but the image persists, the image of waters that refuse to be crossed, of a sea that kept its secret by preventing approach, of the destroyed civilization protected in death by barriers that had not existed in life. For generations after the catastrophe, according to Plato's account, sailors knew that something had changed in the Atlantic. They encountered waters that their predecessors had crossed freely, but that now resisted passage. They told stories of what might lie beneath the shoals, passed down rumors of a great kingdom that the sea had swallowed. The memory of Atlantis survived not as history, but as sailors' legend, as the explanation for why certain waters could not be navigated, as the mystery that the impassable mud concealed. This tradition of sunken lands beneath Atlantic waters persists in the folklore of cultures that have lived along the ocean's shores. The Breton legends speak of cities drowned off the coast, of church bells that can still be heard ringing beneath the waves on certain nights. The Irish tales of High Brazil describe an island that appears and disappears, that can be glimpsed through fog but never reached. The Welsh stories of Cantraguelod tell of a kingdom lost to the sea when a drunken watchman is failed to close the sluice gates. These later legends cannot be direct memories of Atlantis. The details differ, the locations vary, the causes of destruction are particular to each telling. But they share a common structure, the conviction that the sea conceals what it once destroyed, that beneath the waves lie kingdoms whose inhabitants did not escape, that the waters remember even when human memory has failed. The mud that guarded the memory was both physical and metaphorical. The actual conditions that prevented navigation, whatever their cause, were matched by the conditions that prevented knowledge. As generations passed, as the catastrophe receded further into the past, the truth about Atlantis became increasingly difficult to access. The records that might have clarified the story were lost or destroyed. The peoples who might have remembered were themselves forgotten. The knowledge that Egyptian priests claimed to possess became increasingly difficult to verify as Egyptian civilization itself declined. By Plato's time, Atlantis existed only in the story that the priests had told Solon, that Solon had told his relatives, that had passed through generations until it reached the philosopher who would finally write it down. The chain of transmission was long enough to introduce doubt, to raise questions about what had been lost or changed in the retelling, to transform what might have been history into what seemed like myth. The mud that blocked physical navigation has its parallel in the obscurity that blocks intellectual navigation. Every approach to Atlantis encounters resistance. The resistance of evidence that does not quite confirm, of details that do not quite fit, of explanations that explain some aspects while leaving others mysterious. The shoals that prevented ancient ships prevent modern understanding as well, keep us at distance from what we seek, maintain the barrier between the known and the unknowable. We drift now in imagination over waters that might be the waters where Atlantis sank. Atlantic waters, if we accept Plato's geography, though countless other locations have been proposed. The surface gives no indication of what lies below. The depths, if they could be reached, might reveal only ordinary ocean floor, or might reveal something that would change everything we think we know. The search has been conducted many times with technologies that Plato could not have imagined. Sonar and submersibles, satellite imaging and deep-sea cameras. The ocean floor has been mapped with increasing precision. revealing mountains and trenches and volcanic formations that existed long before humans walked the earth. But Atlantis has not been found. The mud that guarded the memory has not yielded its secret to modern investigation any more than it yielded to ancient navigation. Perhaps there is nothing to find. Perhaps Plato's account was allegory from the beginning. A philosophical thought experiment dressed in geographical detail to make it vivid. Perhaps the mud was never real, was always metaphor for the obscurity that surrounds all attempts to know the deep past. Or perhaps the finding would require something other than technology, would require a kind of approach that we have not yet developed. A way of knowing that unites scientific investigation with the intuition that led Plato to write, and that leads readers to feel that something true lies beneath the mythological surface. The mud guards still. The waters keep their secrets. The memory persists in fragments that never quite coalesce into certainty. We close this meditation as ancient sailors might have closed their voyages, turning back from waters they could not cross, carrying reports of what they had encountered, adding their testimony to the growing tradition of an ocean that refused to be fully known. The mud remembers what it covers. The memory guards what it contains. And somewhere beneath the surface, in depths that no one has reached with understanding, the secret waits. From the moment Plato's dialogues began to circulate, the search for Atlantis began. Where was this island that had sunk beneath the sea? Could its ruins be found? Could the magnificent civilization that Plato described be verified then, excavated, understood? The questions have driven seekers across centuries and continents, have produced theories beyond counting, have revealed more about human longing than about Atlantean history. The earliest seekers looked where Plato had pointed, beyond the pillars of Heracles, in the Atlantic Ocean that had swallowed the island. The problem was obvious. The Atlantic was vast, largely uncharted, and gave no obvious indication of where specifically the search should focus. Plato's description placed Atlantis in front of the pillars, which might mean immediately beyond them or might mean anywhere in the ocean that stretched westward toward horizons no Mediterranean sailor had crossed. When European explorers reached the Americas, some believed they had found Atlantis, or at least the great continent that Plato mentioned as lying beyond the island, the landmass to which Atlantis had served as stepping stone. The Spanish chronicler Francisco López de Gómara proposed in 1553 that the Aztec and Maya civilizations were descendants of Atlantean survivors, that the pyramids of Mesoamerica and the temples of Plato's description shared a common origin. The idea persisted for centuries, supported by apparent similarities between Old World and New World cultures that might suggest common ancestry. The 19th century produced the most elaborate Atlantis theories. Ignatius Donnelly's 1882 book, Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, became a bestseller by arguing that Atlantis had been a real mid-Atlantic civilization, that it had colonized both sides of the ocean, that all ancient cultures derived their achievements from Atlantean influence. Donnelly catalogued apparent parallels between Egyptian and Mesoamerican pyramids, between Mediterranean and Native American myths, between cultural practices separated by oceans that should have prevented contact. His work was not scholarly by modern standards, but it established patterns of argument that Atlantis theorists continue to employ. The 20th century brought new locations and new theories. Some seekers pointed to the island of Thera, Santorini, in the Aegean, whose volcanic eruption around 1600 BCE had devastated Minoan civilization. A historical catastrophe that might have been transformed into the Atlantis legend through exaggeration and transmission. Others proposed that Atlantis was not a single island, but a reference to the Bronze Age collapse that brought down multiple civilizations simultaneously. Still others looked to the Richa structure in the Sahara, a geological formation whose concentric rings eerily resemble Plato's description of Atlantis's layout. The most radical theories placed Atlantis in Antarctica, suggesting that the southern continent had occupied a different position before crustal displacement moved it to its present polar location. Proponents argued that an advanced civilization had flourished in Antarctica when its climate was temperate, that its destruction resulted from the shift that relocated it to freezing latitudes. The theory requires geological assumptions that mainstream science does not accept, but it has attracted followers who find in it an explanation for both Atlantis and other ancient mysteries. Each theory has its advocates and its critics. Each fits some aspects of Plato's description while failing to fit others. The Aegean theories cannot account for Plato's placement of Atlantis in the Atlantic, beyond the pillars. The Atlantic theories cannot produce convincing archaeological evidence of a submerged civilization. The Antarctic theories require scientific assumptions that most scientists reject. The search continues nonetheless. New technologies permit exploration of ocean floors, of submerged coastlines, of regions that earlier seekers could not reach. Every few years, a new claim emerges, a formation spotted on sonar, a structure glimpsed through satellite imaging, a site that someone believes matches Plato's specifications. The claims receive attention, generate excitement, and eventually fade when they cannot be substantiated. The pattern has repeated so often that serious scholars have largely abandoned the search, leaving it to enthusiasts whose passion exceeds their evidence. And yet the search persists, because the need it serves persists. The search for Atlantis is not merely archaeological curiosity, but existential quest. The hope that paradise once existed, that human beings once achieved something magnificent, that the Golden Age is not merely myth, but memory. Finding Atlantis would validate these hopes, would prove that human potential has heights we have forgotten, that civilization can achieve what our recorded history has not achieved. Not finding Atlantis has its own meaning. The failure, if it is failure, reveals the power of story, the capacity of words to create realities that no physical evidence can match. The Atlantis that exists in Plato's dialogues and in human imagination may be more powerful than any ruins could be, may affect human consciousness more deeply than any archaeological site. The search may be the point, not the finding, the perpetual reaching towards something that remains just out of reach. We stand now with the seekers at the edge of whatever expedition they are mounting, aboard ships, scanning ocean floors, beside excavations in Mediterranean sites, bent over satellite images looking for telltale signs. The hope is the same hope that has driven seekers for 24 centuries. That somewhere, somehow, the evidence exists, waiting to be found. The light catches a formation on the display. The sonar returns an anomaly. The structure seems too regular to be natural. Hearts quicken. Voices rise with excitement. Then the closer examination, the expert analysis, the gradual deflation as what seemed significant proves explicable through ordinary causes. The formation is geological. The anomaly is instrument error. The structure is natural after all. The seekers return to their maps, their theories, their hopes. Tomorrow there will be another search, another possibility, another chance that this time the finding will occur. We close this meditation with the seekers, not in disappointment, but in solidarity. The search itself has value, keeps alive the questions that Plato raised, preserves the sense of wonder that his account was meant to inspire, maintains the connection between present and past that all history serves. The seekers follow the riddle westward. The riddle leads them onward, and somewhere, in the depths of ocean or the depths of imagination, Atlantis waits to be found, or waits to remain forever unfound, which may in the end be the same kind of waiting. Close your eyes now and descend with me into the imagination's depths, into the sunken Atlantis that has never been photographed, but has been painted and described and dreamed countless times across the centuries since Plato first recorded its destruction. This is not the Atlantis of archaeology, which may not exist. This is the Atlantis of vision, which certainly exists and has existed in human consciousness for over 2 millennia. The waters here are not dark, as actual deep waters would be, but luminous, lit by some source that imagination provides without explaining. The light filters down through the fathoms, blue and gentle, illuminating what lies on the ocean floor with a radiance that suggests sanctity rather than mere visibility. This is dreaming light, sacred light, the light that illuminates temples in the mind's eye. And temples there are. The great structure where Poseidon's statue once stood has collapsed, but not disappeared. Columns lie scattered like felled trees, carved with symbols that the water has not quite erased. The walls that were covered with orichalcum show the greenish tint of long submersion. But the metal's gleam persists beneath the patina, flashes when the dreaming light strikes at certain angles, reminds the observer of the glory that once shone here in the upper world. Fish move through the ruins, not the fish of any particular ocean, but dream fish, creatures of form and color that serve the vision rather than biological accuracy. They swim through doorways where priests once walked, circle columns where worshippers once stood, occupy spaces that were never meant for them, but that they have made their own across the millennia since the waters rose. The concentric rings are still visible from above, if the dreamer rises to look down upon the whole. The pattern that Poseidon created persists in the seafloor topography. Circles within circles. The sacred geometry that cultures across the world have recognized as meaningful. The shape that represents wholeness and perfection and the divine order that underlies apparent chaos. In the esoteric traditions that have elaborated upon Plato's account, Atlantis was not merely a prosperous civilization, but a center of occult wisdom, a repository of knowledge that subsequent ages have lost. The theosophists who developed these traditions spoke of Atlantean technology powered by crystals, of flying machines and advanced engineering, of spiritual achievements that made modern civilizations seem primitive by comparison. The sunken temples in their vision contained not merely religious art, but the records of this wisdom, preserved for those who would eventually learn to retrieve them. Edgar Cayce, the American mystic who claimed to access information through trance states, described Atlantis in terms that blended Plato with theosophy with his own visions. He spoke of destruction by misuse of crystal technology, of migrations to Egypt and the Americas before the final catastrophe, of records preserved in hidden chambers beneath the Sphinx that would eventually be discovered. His Atlantis was more elaborate than Plato's, more technologically advanced, more connected to other ancient mysteries, and equally unverifiable. These elaborations may seem distant from Plato's original account, may seem to obscure rather than illuminate what the philosopher intended. But they reveal something about the psychological function of the Atlantis myth, the need for a golden age, for a lost paradise, for the conviction that humanity once achieved something magnificent and might achieve it again. The elaborations serve this need by making Atlantis more golden, more paradisiacal, more magnificent than even Plato described. The dreaming waters preserve all versions, the scholarly and the mystical, the archaeological and the occult, the skeptical and the credulous. In imagination's depths, there is no need to choose between them. No need to determine which is true and which is fantasy. The temples that the dreaming waters shelter contain all the meanings that human consciousness has invested in them, all the hopes that the sunken island has represented, all the yearnings that the search has expressed. We sink deeper now, toward the heart of the submerged city, toward the central island where the greatest temple stood. The water here is still and warm, impossibly so. But dreams do not obey the laws that govern waking experience. The silence is complete, as though the sea itself were holding its breath, as though the approach to sacred ground required the hush that sacred ground has always demanded. The temple entrance appears before us, or what remains of it. The great doors have fallen, have become part of the debris that time accumulates around all human constructions. But the threshold remains, the boundary between ordinary space and the Holy of Holies, the line that once only priests could cross. We cross it in imagination. As imagination permits what physical reality does not. Within, the darkness is not quite darkness, is the same luminous shadow that illuminates the rest of this submerged world. The statue of Poseidon has toppled, has fragmented into pieces that lie scattered across the temple floor. The nereids that surrounded him have separated from their dolphins, have come to rest in corners and against walls in the random arrangements that catastrophe creates. But the pillar remains, the orichalcum pillar, where the laws were inscribed, where the blood of sacred bulls once flowed, where the kings gathered to renew their covenant. It stands still, anchored to the floor by the divine will that placed it there. We cannot read what is written on it. The language is too old, the symbols too unfamiliar, the meaning too deep for casual understanding. But we can sense that meaning persists, that the laws that Poseidon inscribed have not been erased by the millennia of submersion, that the covenant the pillar represents remains in force, even though none remain to honor it. We close this meditation as the dreamer must eventually close every dream, by ascending, by returning to the surface, by leaving behind what cannot be brought back. The temples beneath the dreaming waters will remain when we have gone. We'll wait for the next dreamer who descends. We'll preserve what memory and imagination have invested in them. The vision fades as light returns. The temples recede into the depths, and above the surface, the waking world resumes its ordinary course, unchanged by what has been dreamed, yet somehow connected to it, somehow informed by the journey that imagination has permitted. The temples wait, the waters dream, and somewhere between sleeping and waking, Atlantis endures. There is a tradition, older than theosophy, older than the modern occult revival, perhaps as old as Plato's account itself, that the sinking of Atlantis did not destroy all Atlantean wisdom, but scattered it, sent it flowing outward to other lands where survivors carried what they could preserve, where seeds of the old knowledge took root and grew into the civilizations that history records. The tradition is unprovable but persistent. It appears in the writings of esotericists who claim that Egyptian priesthoods preserved Atlantean learning, that the pyramids were built according to Atlantean principles, that the ancient wisdom of the Nile derived from knowledge carried there by refugees from the sinking island. It appears in the theories of those who see common origins behind apparently independent achievements. Pyramids in Egypt and Mesoamerica, flood myths in Mesopotamia and China, calendar systems and astronomical knowledge appearing in cultures that had no obvious means of contact. The idea has a certain logic, even if it lacks proof. If a great civilization had existed and then catastrophically ended, survivors would have carried what they knew to whatever lands would receive them. The knowledge would have been transmitted to new populations, would have been adapted to new circumstances, would have evolved in different directions as different environments and different needs shaped it. The fragments would not be identical to the original, would be adapted, translated, transformed, but would retain enough common elements to be recognizable as derivatives of a single source. The 19th century scholars who developed these ideas catalogued the apparent parallels. Pyramids, yes, but also sacred mountains. Axis mundi, structures that connected Earth to heaven in similar ways across cultures that should have had no contact. Flood stories, but also creation myths, cosmological accounts, stories of gods and heroes that seem to follow common patterns despite their surface differences. The parallels might be coincidence, might be the result of independent minds solving similar problems in similar ways. But they might also be echoes, might be the fading reverberations of a common source that catastrophe had silenced but not entirely destroyed. The Egyptian connection is most thoroughly developed in the tradition. Plato himself suggested it by placing his source among Egyptian priests, by having those priests claim knowledge that went back 9,000 years. The implication was clear. Egypt had preserved what others had forgotten, had maintained archives that could reconstruct a history that catastrophe had erased elsewhere. The Atlantean wisdom on this reading had not merely survived in Egypt, but had shaped Egyptian civilization from its beginnings. The evidence proposed for this connection varies in quality and persuasiveness. The Sphinx, some claim, shows water erosion consistent with rainfall patterns that existed thousands of years before the conventional date of its construction. Evidence that would push Egyptian civilization back toward the Atlantean time frame. The precision of the pyramid's construction, others argue, exceeds what should have been possible with the technology of dynastic Egypt, suggests access to knowledge that conventional history cannot explain. The astronomical alignments of ancient Egyptian structures point to dates thousands of years before the periods when official history says they were built. These claims are disputed by mainstream scholars who find them unconvincing or applicable through conventional means. The erosion on the Sphinx may result from subsurface water, not rainfall. The pyramid's precision, while impressive, falls within the range of what careful engineering and abundant labor could accomplish. The astronomical alignments may be coincidental, or may have been retrofitted by builders aware of earlier configurations. Yet the tradition persists, finds new adherents with each generation, adapts itself to new discoveries and new technologies. The search for Atlantean echoes in Egypt has been joined by searches in Central America, in South America, in India, in any ancient civilization that achieved something impressive and mysterious. The impulse behind the search remains constant. The conviction that the achievements of the ancient world point towards something that conventional history has not adequately explained. We stand now in imagination among the echoes, listening for the voice of which they are reflections. In an Egyptian temple, watching priests perform rituals whose origins they themselves may not fully understand. In a Mesoamerican pyramid, noting the similarities to structures half a world away. In an Indian text, reading descriptions of technologies and catastrophes that seem to echo Plato's account while differing in every specific detail. The echoes do not prove that Atlantis existed. They prove that human cultures share common structures of thought, common ways of organizing sacred space, common narratives of golden ages and catastrophic ends. The commonalities may derive from common origins, or may derive from common humanity, from the fact that minds shaped by similar evolutionary pressures produce similar solutions to similar problems. But the echoes suggest something. even if we cannot say precisely what. They suggest that the world's traditions carry memories we have not fully decoded, that the stories told by ancient cultures may contain more history than we have recognized, that the past may be deeper and stranger than the records we possess can reveal. The wisdom that sank beneath the waves may have sunk entirely, leaving no trace that we can recover. Or it may have survived in fragments, scattered across civilizations that did not know they were inheritors, preserved in forms we have not learned to recognize. We close this meditation in the space where echoes fade, where the faint reverberations of whatever Atlantis was, or might have been, dissolve into the silence from which they briefly emerged. The wisdom remains uncertain, remains debatable, remain part of the mystery rather than its solution. But the echoes persist. They sound in temples whose builders are forgotten. They resonate in myths whose origins are lost. They remind us that the past may contain voices we have not yet learned to hear. The wisdom sank. The echoes remain. And somewhere in the space between silence and sound, the truth waits to be understood. We come now to the end, though with Atlantis there is never truly an end. Only the recognition that the story continues beyond any telling, that the mystery persists beyond any investigation, that the island waits in places that no search has reached, and perhaps no search can reach. Plato left his account unfinished. The Cretia breaks off in mid-sentence, stops just as Zeus was about to pronounce judgment on the corrupted civilization. Some scholars believe the dialogue was never completed, that death or other duties prevented Plato from finishing what he had begun. Others believe the incompleteness was intentional, that the philosopher chose to leave the story suspended, to deny readers the closure they sought, to make the mystery permanent. The incompleteness has its own meaning. It suggests that some stories should not be finished, that some questions should not be answered, that some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious. The search for Atlantis has continued for 24 centuries, precisely because Plato did not provide resolution, did not describe the final catastrophe in detail, did not tell us exactly what Zeus said or what judgment followed. What would we have lost if Plato had finished? We would have lost the space in which imagination operates, the gap that invites each reader to complete the story in their own way, the openness that has allowed Atlantis to mean different things to different ages. The unfinished account is more powerful than any finished account could be, creates possibilities that closure would have foreclosed. The island waits in memory's tide, rising and falling with the waves of attention that each generation pays to it. Never quite visible above the surface, but never quite gone beneath it either. The tide brings Atlantis closer when the world grows weary of its present limitations, when the dream of a golden age becomes more compelling than the realities of ordinary history. The tide draws it back when skepticism prevails, when the search seems hopeless, when the practical matters of the present demand attention. But the tide always turns. The interest always returns. The seekers always emerge again, armed with new technologies and new theories, convinced that this time the finding will occur. that the mystery that defeated their predecessors will yield to their superior methods. We sit now in the quiet that follows all journeys, in the silence that descends when the story has been told as far as it can be told. The island is not more visible than it was when we began. The mystery is not more solved. The questions that Plato raised remain the same questions, with the same absence of certain answers. What we have gained is not knowledge, but contemplation. We have dwelt within the mystery for a time, have allowed it to work upon us as mysteries do, have opened ourselves to what it might mean that human beings have dreamed of Atlantis for over 2,000 years. The contemplation matters, even if, especially if it leads to no definite conclusions. The island waits, because waiting is what it does. It waited in the waters after it sank. It waited in the Egyptian archives that preserved its memory. It waited in Plato's dialogues through the centuries, when those dialogues were copied and transmitted, and eventually printed. It waits now in whatever form its waiting takes, physical or metaphorical, beneath the waves or within the mind. Perhaps Atlantis will be found someday. Technology advances. The oceans are being mapped with increasing precision. The past reveals its secrets gradually to those patient enough to seek them. Perhaps a formation will be discovered that matches Plato's description, that cannot be explained as natural, that forces the reconsideration of everything we thought we knew about the deep past. Or perhaps Atlantis will never be found because it was never there to be found, was always source and only Plato's creation. A philosophical device dressed in geographical detail. A thought experiment that succeeded beyond what its creator could have imagined in capturing human attention. Perhaps the finding would be less meaningful than the searching would close possibilities that the openness has preserved. The distinction may matter less than it seems. The Atlantis that exists in human consciousness. The golden civilization, the island of rings and temples. The kingdom that fell from grace and was swallowed by the sea. That Atlantis is real in the way that all persistent dreams are real. It shapes how we think about lost civilizations, about the possibilities of human achievement, about the relationship between virtue and survival. It provides a framework for hope and for warning, for aspiration and for humility. We close this chronicle not with discovery, but with wonder, with the recognition that some mysteries are gifts, that some questions enrich us by remaining unanswered, that the silence at the heart of the Atlantis legend is part of what makes it sacred. The island waits. It has always waited. It will wait beyond any telling, beyond any seeking, beyond any finding or not finding, in the depths of ocean or imagination, beneath waters that may be real or may be the waters of memory, surrounded by fish that swim through dream temples and coral that grows on dream columns. Atlantis endures. Rest now. The journey has been long, and the contemplation has been deep. The island will be there when you return to it, as it was there before you came, as it will be there for all who come after. The tide rises, the tide falls, and in the space between where memory and mystery meet, the island waits. It has always waited. It waits still. Conclusion. 750 words. The waters close over what we have contemplated tonight, but they do not close finally. Do not seal the mystery away where it cannot be accessed. The story of Atlantis remains available to anyone who wishes to enter it, remains open to interpretation and investigation and imagination, remains part of the inheritance that Plato left to all who came after him. We have traced the words that the philosopher whispered to the ages, have followed them from the amber light of Athens to the temple shadows of Sais. We have stood at the pillars beyond which memory fades, have descended with the priests who kept the older counting into archives whose contents we can only imagine. We have walked the concentric rings of the island, have glimpsed the temples where kings gathered by torchlight, have sensed the corruption that crept into the divine blood until the divine portion grew too thin to sustain what it had created. We have witnessed the war that heaven remembered and earth forgot. We have experienced, as far as words can convey such experience, the night of thunder and the rising sea. We have drifted over the mud that guarded the memory, have followed the seekers who pursued the riddle westward, have descended into the dreaming waters where imagination preserves what catastrophe destroyed. We have listened for the echoes of wisdom that may have survived the sinking, have contemplated what fragments might persist in the achievements of civilizations that did not know they were inheritors. We have arrived finally at the recognition that the island waits in whatever form waiting takes, waits for seekers who may find it or may find only the seeking itself. What have we learnt from this journey through the mystery of Atlantis? Perhaps only this, that some stories matter more than facts can explain, that some mysteries serve purposes that solutions would undermine, that the human need to imagine golden ages is as real as the golden ages themselves may or may not have been. Atlantis gives form to our yearning. It provides a shape for the conviction that human beings are capable of more than we have achieved in recorded history, that somewhere in the depths of time lie heights we have forgotten how to reach. Whether those heights were actually attained or have only been imagined matters less than the fact that we imagine them, that we return to them generation after generation, that we refuse to let the waters close finally over the possibility that they represent. The night deepens now and sleep approaches. The contemplations we have pursued will continue in whatever processing the unconscious performs while the waking mind rests. The images will recur. The rings of water and land, the gleam of orichalcum in temple light, the silence of streets beneath the sea. They will blend with other images, other memories, other mysteries that the mind carries and transforms. Plato did not finish his account. We cannot finish ours. The story continues in everyone who hears it, continues in every search and speculation, continues in the persistence of wonder across the millennia. The island is not found. The island is not lost. The island waits. It waits in the spaces between certainty and doubt, between history and myth, between the depths of ocean and the depths of human longing. Rest now in that waiting. Let the waters hold what they hold. Let the mystery remain mysterious. Let the night bring whatever dreams arise from what we have contemplated. Atlantis will be there when morning comes, unchanged by our attention, as ancient as it was when Plato first wrote of it, as new as each moment of wondering about it. The words have been spoken. The silence returns. And somewhere beyond the pillars, beneath the dreaming waters, in the tide of memory that rises and falls and rises again, the island waits, as it has always waited, as it will always wait. Sleep well. The ancient mystery will keep its vigil while you rest.